If Rwanda is mentioned in modern day, what usually comes to people's minds are the horrible events that happened in 1994 that left over 800,000 people dead in a space of 90 days. Before all this, Rwanda, just like most African countries, had an interesting post-colonial period, one that would shape the events that led up to the 1994 genocide. This is not an episode about the Rwandan genocide, but about the life of Rwanda's first president, Grégoire Kayibanda. It will help us understand Rwanda, the country as we know it today. This is the rise and fall of Grégoire Kayibanda. To understand the rise of Kayibanda, we need to look into the ethnic composition of Rwanda. The country composed mainly of three tribes: the Hutus, Tutsis, and the Twas, also known as the Pygmies. Kayibanda belonged to the majority tribe of the Hutus, who occupied the region for hundreds of years before the coming of the Tutsi people. Nevertheless, the Tutsis swiftly dominated the Hutu people through the creation of a feudal state. They relegated the Hutus to peasantry while they established warrior kingdoms in Rwanda and Burundi, headed by kings known as the Mwamis. Throughout the colonial era, Rwanda and Burundi were governed as a single territory known as Rwanda-Burundi, first under the Germans and then the Belgians, who acquired the territory under the Treaty of Versailles. Before the coming of the Belgians and the Catholic missionaries, the Hutu and the Tutsis lived peacefully until the Belgian colonial officials and the Catholic missionaries of Africa told them to see each other as separate racial groups. Because of 500 years of intermarriage, the Hutus and the Tutsis couldn't be differentiated, but the Belgians segregated the Tutsis based on physical appearance. Where appearance was indecisive or proof of ancestry was lacking, a simple formula was applied. Those with 10 cows or more were classified as Tutsis, and those with fewer as Hutu. And so, the Hutus could not become Tutsis. In the 1920s, the Belgians introduced a system of identity cards specifying the tribe to which a holder belonged. In their policy of segregation, preference was given to the Tutsi in all aspects of life. For example, all academic scholarships were awarded to Tutsis, leaving their Hutu counterparts ordinary and uneducated. Given their numerical disadvantage, the Belgians further relied on the Tutsis as the ruling aristocracy of the Hutu to enforce control and enabling them to extend their hegemony over the Hutu. The Catholic Church worsened the situation when it promoted the Tutsi cause in government positions, and all branches of administration, including the trivial ones, were reserved for the Tutsis. In the forced labor system that the Belgians ran, Tutsis were employed as taskmasters over the Hutu laborers. Tutsi chiefs were used to enforce order and discipline. By the late 1930s, the Belgians had made ethnicity the defining feature of ordinary life in both Rwanda and Burundi. What the Belgians didn't see was that by perpetuating a pro-Tutsi policy against the Hutu, they were steering a pot of revolution in communities that had lived peacefully along each other for centuries. After 1945, a Hutu elite developed, led by Grégoire Kayibanda, leading to the decline of relations between the two groups. Scared, the Tutsi leadership agitated for speedy independence to cement their power, while the Hutu elite called for the transfer of power from Tutsi minority to the Hutu majority. In 1957, Hutus, led by Kayibanda and 8 other intellectuals, published the Bahutu Manifesto. In the manifesto, they denounced the exploitation of the Hutus by the Tutsis and called for the double liberation of the Hutu people, first from the race of the white colonials and second from the Tutsi oppressors. The result of this was the formation of political parties based on ethnicity. Grégoire Kayibanda created the Hutu social movement, which advocated for equal treatment for the long-suppressed Hutu people. The Tutsis responded soon after with the formation of the Rwanda National Union, UNAR. In 1959, Kayibanda created a new political party called Rwanda Democratic Movement, Party of the Movement of the Hutu Emancipation, Pame Hutu. On the 1st of November 1959, Tutsi youths attacked Pame Hutu party leaders Ewan Abe Joseph Sibomana and Dominique Mbonyomutwa. Later that year, violence erupted between the Tutsis and the Hutu political supporters. Approximately 300 people were killed in the violence, and at least 336,000 Tutsis fled to neighboring Uganda, Tanzania, and Congo. During this time, Kayibanda went into hiding and wrote on the 27th of November the famous lines that the Hutu and the Tutsi are two nations in a single state, two nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feeling as if they were dwellers of different zones or habitants of different planets. He also put forth a proposition that the Hutu and the Tutsis should be segregated into two separate zones, as a first step towards a confederal organization. At this critical juncture, the Belgians decided to change sides, to now favor the Hutus, which amounted to betrayal of the Tutsis. Elections followed the next year, with Pame Hutu under Kayibanda winning the majority of government seats, a major milestone in the Hutu struggle to gain control over the state. The effect on the monarchy was immediate. 2 years after Pame Hutu was formed, the Tutsi monarchy was voted out and the Hutu were in. Tutsi king Kigali V left the country never to return. Kayibanda was named prime minister and charged with forming a provisional government on 26 October 1960, cementing the Hutu hold on power. In January 1961, Rwanda was declared a republic, bringing an end to the Tutsi monarchy, which had lasted for centuries. In the First Republic, Kayibanda established a pro-Hutu policy and a de facto one-party system governed by his party and determined to keep the Tutsis in a subordinate role. Grégoire Kayibanda, the father of the Rwandan state and Rwanda's first elected president, was born in 1924 at Tare, southwest of the capital Kigali. His parents were peasant farmers, having small holdings of bananas, coffee plants, and other crops. One of the 13 children, Kayibanda was among the 5 children who survived past childhood. His parents produced so many children to keep up with traditional attitudes concerning the need for large families and also to adhere to Catholic Church's opposition to birth control. Kayibanda in turn had 10 children of his own. At 8, he attended primary school at Tare Primary School in 1932, and for secondary school, he was enrolled in the prestigious Le Petit Séminaire Saint-Léon. He made friends with several students at the school who would become sympathizers, if not promoters, of the Hutu movement's democratic ideals. Among those who acquired some fame were Alois Munyangaju, Anastase Makuza, Justin Kalibwami, and Gaspard Mudashimwa. After secondary school, Kayibanda was admitted to the Grand Seminary at Nyakibanda to further his studies. In 1949, he left the seminary and a path to priesthood to teach at Lyon Class Institute in Kabugai. While teaching at Lyon Class, in 1950 he married his wife. His wife was from a well-off Tutsi family and profoundly Christian. In May 1950, he joined 2 groups in the Catholic action structure, the Legion of Mary, of which he became president, and the League of the Sacred Heart. These 2 groups were characterized by group prayer, acts of charity, and mutual assistance, as well as brotherly behavior and commitment to the activities of the parish. The structure of the Legion of Mary worked so well for Kayibanda that he structured the Pame Hutu on its model. Kayibanda broadened his voice in 1953 when he joined the Catholic newspaper Chinyamateka, of which he became editor-in-chief of the newspaper. After being elected president on the 26th of October 1961, Kayibanda appointed a government made up of members of Pame Hutu and UNAR, which was predominantly Tutsi, to foster unity. In February 1962, UNAR guerrillas kept raiding his government from Uganda and hit the Mugira and Gatunda communes in Byumba Prefecture and killing 2 police officers. Nevertheless, the UNAR was given the public health and livestock ministries in the new Republican government. Yet again, UNAR raiders continued to attack Kayibanda's government, this time in Nkana commune and again in Byumba prefecture, killing 4 and stealing communal funds. When Kayibanda assumed the presidency, the country was severely underdeveloped. There were no buildings for its ministries, nor for its municipalities, and little for its decentralized social services, no savings in banks, pension funds, or public transports. In Kigali, the capital, there was a small airport capable of handling only outdated DC-3s. When Belgium reduced its aid because of the events in the Congo, Rwanda found itself essentially alone regarding outside funding. Therefore, an urgent need was to find international financial support. Under Kayibanda, a Ministry of Planning was set up in February 1963, followed by the National Planning Committee in June 1964. Actions were taken to try to rectify the fraudulent monetary practices and the enormous deficit in the balance of payments, a spectacular leap in retail prices and a serious drop in purchasing power of the producers of the leading exports like tea, coffee, pyrethrum, and mined ores. Kayibanda implemented extreme austerity measures, reducing the number of ministries from 11 to 9 and that of municipalities from 229 to 141, and that of canton courts from 109 to 75. Agricultural land space was increased by 50% by clearing swamps, marshes, and by irrigation of arid regions. The capital of Kigali, which was completely underdeveloped and little occupied, became a primary focus of Kayibanda, where he widened the streets, constructed housing, developed water and electricity supplies, as well as constructed buildings for government and commercial purposes. For the new nation not to have a thriving capital in which to attract entrepreneurs and funders and to receive foreign dignitaries was unacceptable and embarrassing to Kayibanda. Under his administration, Rwanda opened its own central bank, the Bank of Rwanda, with many branches across the country. In January 1964, a tariff barrier was established on the border of Burundi, causing numerous companies established in Bujumbura to split and to install head offices, workshops, stocks, and warehouses in Kigali. Directly after independence, Kayibanda eliminated the Obuhake contractual system, which means work to access land, and allotted the Hutu over 60% of the cattle held among them and the Tutsis. He further abolished the land contract system, which had required clients to make payments to the landholders, either in labor or goods. These abolitions cut off traditional support to the Tutsis and furthered the Pame-Hutu drive for a situation representing political and economic parity among the population. Known after the name of his own village as the Hermit of Gitarama, Grégoire Kayibanda rarely made public appearances and hardly ever traveled abroad. He was said to be a model of frugality, one who wore shabby clothes and patched shoes. When he was driven, it was in a humble Volkswagen. After 1964, Tutsi presence was effectively removed from the political arena. The Tutsis were found in education, business, church, even in government employment, but not in the political arena. The political sphere was confined to the Hutus. Over the next 3 years, Kayibanda increased his power step by step. By 1965, Pame-Hutu was the only legal party in the country. At the elections held that year, Kayibanda won by 98%. Well, because he appeared alone on the ballot for president. He was re-elected in 1969, again as the only candidate. Once the internal Tutsi parties had been liquidated and their leaders killed, Kayibanda's political ammunition was directed at AFRISTORY, Association for Social Promotion of the Masses, the one Hutu-led revolutionary party that had tried to recruit and organize the Tutsis into its ranks. Between 1964 and 1967, AFRISTORY stalwarts were slowly but surely eased out of any political or administrative responsibility. Remember the events of 1959, which led to an exodus of around 336,000 Tutsis to neighboring countries of Uganda, Burundi, Congo, and Tanganyika? Well, while in the refugee camps, Tutsi exiles formed small insurgent groups to restore the Tutsi monarchy. The border raids they carried out inside Rwanda were largely ineffective. In December 1963, however, a group of 200 men, armed with bows, arrows, and handmade rifles crossed the border from Burundi, linked up with the local Tutsis, attacked a military camp, seized weapons and vehicles, and headed to the capital Kigali. This came to be known as the Inyenzi attacks. Though the invaders were quickly overpowered, President Kayibanda used the attack as an opportunity to crush any remnants of the Tutsi opposition. No Tutsi politician in Rwanda survived. They were rounded up and immediately executed. Radio Kigali broadcasted repeated warnings that the Tutsi terrorists were seeking to reimpose their rule. So, they instructed local officials to organize self-defense groups. In Gikongoro, Hutu vigilantes armed with machetes, spears, and clubs set out to kill every Tutsi in sight. Men, women, and children, some 5,000 Tutsis, died. At Shigira, near the border with Congo, over 100 Tutsi women and children, rather than face slaughter by the Hutu mobs, drowned themselves in the river. The World Council of Churches estimated that in all at least 10,000 Tutsis were killed. Tens of thousands more fled into exile. The political effect of the Inyenzi attacks was to give a considerable boost to the fading popularity of Kayibanda. Before the attacks, the government was at a point of collapse, faced with enormous dissensions among themselves. Not only did Kayibanda survive the attacks, but the attacks made him survive the dissensions and increased his popularity. Just as the Tutsi activists in exile gave up their plots, Kayibanda found it useful to resurrect the Tutsi threat when once more his regime was engulfed in political difficulty. This time, coming from neighboring Burundi, where minority Tutsi had held on to power over the Hutu majority. Since independence in 1962, Burundi's history had been even more turbulent than Rwanda's. 2 of the first 3 prime ministers were assassinated. 7 governments had come and gone in quick succession. In 1966, Kayibanda found his match in Captain Michel Mikombero, a Tutsi officer who captured power through a military coup and set out to exterminate the Hutu threat once and for all from Burundi. Hutu members in government and military were purged, politicians and scores of soldiers executed. When the Hutu staged an uprising in 1972, Mikombero exerted revenge on a scale never seen before in independent Africa. Hutus with any kind of education, teachers, church leaders, bank clerks, nurses, traders, civil servants were all rounded up by the army and killed. In a campaign subsequently described as selective genocide, the Hutu elite was virtually eliminated. As many as 200,000 people died. Among those, majority were school-going youths, and over 200,000 people fled into Rwanda. Citing Burundi as an example of the Tutsis' thirst for power and their willingness to kill for it, Kayibanda launched another round of repression, hoping to unite the Hutu behind him. A ruling party pamphlet published in 1972 declared, "Tutsi domination is the origin of all evil. The Hutu have suffered since the beginning of time. It is comparable to a termite mound teeming with every cruelty known to man." The revenge started with Hutu students at the National University in Tare who agitated against their Tutsi colleagues. List of blacklisted Tutsi students, signed by anonymous and self-appointed committees of public safety, appeared on notice boards at the university, at the National Teacher Training College, and at a secondary school. Among those targeted were children of mixed marriages, known as Ibimanyi, and cheaters who were accused of changing their racial affiliation. The threat was enough to get the bulk of 200 Tutsi students at the university to leave. Soon, the lists began to spread at places of employment, which included banks, parastatal companies, private businesses, and even at an embassy. Once again, many of the named Tutsi employees left. Radio Rwanda was used to broadcast appeals inciting the Hutu to rise up and avenge themselves. Some extreme proponents of the Hutu power began to publicly call for a final solution to the Tutsi question. In a rapidly inflamed situation, several Tutsis were murdered. The estimates of the dead ranged anywhere from 600 to 500, whereas thousands fled once again. Ironically, the Kayibanda regime faced growing criticism in the 1960s that it had not done enough to advance Hutu representation in civil society. The critique first came from the unemployed Hutu school leavers who had left primary school for lack of resources and were ploughing urban streets looking for employment. Others, in spite of being degree holders, lacked employment to which they no doubt felt entitled. The combination created a pool of agitators ready to be tapped by an ambitious politician with a keen sense of fresh grievances. The critique focused on government policy in education and employment. It was said that the government was not doing enough to advance Hutu representation in education. While the Hutu were the majority in schools, university enrollment in middle and late 1960s was nearly 90% Tutsi. This was so in spite of government policy restricting the Tutsi enrollment in post-secondary institutions to 10% of the overall figure. The biggest threat to Kayibanda's regime was within his own ranks among the Hutus. You see, the Hutus were also split among factions, between the northern Hutus, who were dominant in the army, and the southern Hutus, who dominated the cabinet. The northern Hutus wanted greater participation in the country's affairs too. Many Hutus complained that the government had done little to solve the tribal and economic problems of Rwanda. In addition, the northern Hutus accused the southern Hutus, especially Kayibanda, of being soft towards the rival Tutsi tribe. 4 days after Kayibanda's final speech at the Independence Day event with no Tutsi attacks coming to his rescue this time, his 11-year rule came to an abrupt end. By this time, President Kayibanda's future had become bleak. During the previous months, he had thrown his support behind the ethnic scapegoating of the Tutsi minority in an effort to deflect the blame for his own regime failures. The tactic had worked when he first seized power, unifying the Hutu majority against the Inyenzi threat. But times had changed. Kayibanda's fate and that of his regime were sealed by his failure to validate the vaulting ambition of the northern officer corps in his army. He underestimated the danger posed by General Juvenal Habyarimana, his defense minister and head of the army. And so, on the 5th of July 1973, Habyarimana and 10 others, who included Major Aloys Nsekalije, Lieutenant Colonel Alexis Kanyarengwe, Major Sabine Benda, Major Laurent Serubuga, Major Laurent Simba, Major Theoneste Bagosora, and Captain Eli Sagatwa, launched a swift and decisive military coup. Within days of his bloodless coup, Habyarimana rounded up hundreds of the former president's supporters, diplomats, military, politicians, ministers, and some of his family. In the subsequent months, they were tortured and strangled to death with ropes using bare hands. Kayibanda's wife, Vera Diane, died of a mystery illness while under house arrest on the 13th of October 1972. Only her husband and children were allowed to attend the burial. On the 15th of December 1976, her husband was starved to death in his own home. According to other accounts, he was put out of his misery with a blow hammer to the skull. No state funeral or lying in state for the man who had brought independence to Rwanda and the godfather of one of Habyarimana's children. Quite the opposite, no one was allowed to see the body, and even a request from the Catholic bishops was refused. Kayibanda was hurriedly and discreetly buried in a small plot in his own garden, besides his beloved wife, Vera Diane. Kayibanda died a pauper. By this time, Juvenal Habyarimana, a fellow Hutu, had taken the steering wheel and was on a rampage, weeding out Kayibanda's remnants. Before Kayibanda's death, Habyarimana's father, Jean-Baptiste, called his son from his bed in a Kigali clinic shortly after the coup. A fervent Catholic and terminally ill, he begged his son not to kill the former president. He said, "My son, I have forbidden you to carry out the coup against Kayibanda. You know he is like a father to you. You have disobeyed me. Now, despite my advice, you have denied it. For pity's sake, don't shed his blood. A curse will be on you the day you dare make an attempt on his life. His blood will haunt you." If these words are to be believed, Jean-Baptiste was right.